Just to introduce myself, I'm Lisa Fain. Good to see you all here. I'm the CEO of Center for Mentoring Excellence, and we are here for our monthly thought leader conversation. I'm eager to dig in, but let me first welcome our guest, Eduardo Briceño, today. He's a global keynote speaker and a facilitator who helps leading companies develop cultures of continuous improvement and high performance. He co-founded and led Mindset Works, which is the first growth mindset development company for over a decade. His TED Talks, which are extraordinary, if you haven't seen them, please watch them, on growth mindset have over 10 million views. And he's the author of the award-winning book, The Performance Paradox. He's a Pahara Aspen Fellow, a member of Aspen Institute's Global Leadership Network, and an inductee in the Happiness Hall of Fame. If we have time, I want to ask you about that. And he holds a degree from the University of Pennsylvania and Stanford. Eduardo, so glad you could join us here today.
Great to be here. Thank you, Lisa. Hi, everybody.
Let's dig in because your work is really based on growth mindset, and I think it'd be great to just ground ourselves in definition. Can you share with us what's a growth mindset and how you've seen organizations successfully shift from a fixed mindset to a growth mindset culture?
Sure. So a growth mindset, I'm you're asking is, when it's become a bit of a buzzword. So when we ask people, what does growth mindset mean? We often get lots of different answers, like growth mindset is being open-minded, or is working hard, or having high expectations, or persevering. And the growth mindset is none of those things. So a growth mindset is a belief, first of all, and it is a belief that people can change, right? That our abilities or qualities are malleable and we can develop them over time. And so we are all a mix of growth mindset and fixed mindset. We might see some things as something that can be developed, like, for example, playing sports or working with numbers or writing poems. And we might see other things as fixed, being good with people, or being intelligent, or being empathetic. We might think that some people are empathetic and others aren't. That would be a fixed mindset about empathy, versus no matter how empathetic I am, I can become more empathetic. Moen says, empathy is one thing that he would like to continue to develop. That's a growth mindset about empathy. And that the reason that's important is that it has a lot of consequences to our psychology, to how we perceive things, what motivations we have, how do we behave in the world. And in a growth mindset, we tend to be more effective learners, and also improve our skills and be able to achieve more, but also develop kind of better relationships with other people, closer relationships, be able to understand other people better, and be able to collaborate with them better. So there are, growth mindset is something we can work on as individuals. And also there's lots of organizations and teams that have set out to develop a growth mindset culture. That's a huge topic, but we can talk more about that. But it starts with being clear about what kind of culture they want to build. And if growth mindset is part of that, what does that mean? What does it mean for people? How do they interact with each other? What do they do? And how do leaders behave? And so that's a very rich topic. We can talk more about if that's of interest.
Yeah. What are some of the challenges and the strategies that organizations can use to make that shift?
Challenges for whether it's individual or organizations, one challenge is that we're all a mix of growth mindset and fixed mindset, and a lot of the systems in the world promote fixed mindset. Some of them promote growth mindset, but mostly they keep us confused somewhere in the middle, right? We all are a mix, we're in the middle, and we haven't really reflected on, and we haven't really become very aware of what our fixed mindsets are, and what kinds of things we do in order to foster a fixed mindset. Like, for example, there's research that shows that when we praise other people for being smart, like, you're so smart, you're so talented, we do it with our best intentions, but that fosters a fixed mindset in other people, right? Or how people are evaluated, or what kinds of things we talk about in meetings, in weekly meetings. If it's all based on performance and evaluation, that tends to foster more of a fixed mindset, versus talking about abilities as things that we're all working to improve, which means we're all working to change ourselves. So in terms of challenges, it's just a lot. It starts with a lot of being unaware of even what's happening and what we're doing to foster more of a growth mindset, a fixed mindset, and the systems that we're part of that foster more of a fixed mindset and of chronic performance. But in terms of like the strategies custom organization can do, there's a lot. I would highlight first is setting the stage, right? So it's getting clear about what kind of culture do we want to build and kind of codifying that, right? So for example, a fantastic organization that has done a fantastic cultural transformation is Microsoft, which is really remarkable because they were already a 40-year-old humongous organization when they started this work in 2014. And what they did is the executive team came together. They first, they asked for feedback from all employees. They got together. They did a, months-long kind of process of trying to figure out what do we care about? How do we want to transform our culture? And they got really clear on that. And growth mindset was one of 5 areas, right? There was diversity and inclusion. There was customer centricity. There was more kind of purpose orientation. There was more one Microsoft of working as one organization rather than silos. And they like unpacked each of those things and figure out what does this mean, right? What does it mean for us to be a more growth mindset organization? And so, for example, they came up with lots of things like what is their performance management system and what do they talk about in meetings? How do leaders model being learners, right? So often when leaders might have the sense that because they're in a position of leadership, they're supposed to be knowers, right? They're supposed to have all the answers. They're supposed to be sure of themselves, but that fosters more of a fixed mindset, right? Because when other people perceive you as a knower, as a know-it-all, as someone who has all the answers, then they're going to emulate those behaviors too, which is the opposite of a learning orientation, right? Learning orientation is, I might know a lot, but I have a lot more to learn, right? I might be wrong in anything that I think right now. And so I'm going to be asking questions. I'm going to be listening better. I'm going to be experimenting more. I'm going to be soliciting feedback. I'm going to be looking at my mistakes and talking about them with other people. I'm going to be talking about what I want to improve and soliciting other people's support in that. And so all of those things are things that are part of being in a growth mindset as an individual or as a team or as an organization. And there's a lot to that. So Microsoft, 10 years in, they still consider that they are still in this journey, in this transformation journey, because it never ends, right? We're always continuing to improve and be more aware of how we can be more learning oriented and continuing to make progress on that.
Do you view growth mindset and learning culture as synonymous?
Yeah, so growth mindset is the belief that we can change and improve. So when companies talk about growth mindset cultures and they talk about learning cultures, I do see it as synonymous. Yeah, it's, when we think about learning, sometimes we can, if we think about growth mindset and learning, we can sometimes uncover some ways that we might be interested in learning, but we might uncover some fixed mindsets that get in the way of learning. Like, for example, we might think about learning as something that's just about facts, right? About increasing our knowledge and not really about changing ourselves. But if we understand that as part of becoming more capable, we need to change ourselves, then we can learn more deeply. So, all of it is together. And I do see kind of learning culture and growth mindset culture as synonymous.
Yeah, I know a lot of folks who are joining us today are in the mentoring world, and this is kind of music to the mentoring person's ears because, so often what we face is that people think mentoring is really just about transfer of knowledge, which does nothing for really a learning mindset, right? It's kind of like pouring in knowledge. It's, the equivalent of studying for a big exam, pouring it in and spitting it out, as opposed to the mentoring is most fertile in a learning culture. And so I love the application of growth mindset to that. Um, there's been some really great questions that have came in advance too, and I want to get to those in a second, and reminding folks who are just joining to please, raise your hands if you have a comment, share in the chat. We'd love to hear from you. I want to talk a little bit though about the role of feedback, and curious how you see the role of feedback reinforcing a growth mindset, and what types of feedback do you see as most effective in promoting this continuous learning and improvement?
Sure. I think in most contexts, especially in most workplace contexts, feedback is the most effective like learning strategy because we are social beings. We're always trying to have an effect on other people, whether it is to help our colleagues or help the people that we serve. And so getting information about what we're doing that's helpful, what we're doing that is not, ideas for how what we can do things differently, that's usually super, super valuable. And so I do think feedback, and in some organizations, they choose to use a different word. I like the word feedback. Organizations might choose to use kind of feed forward or perspectives or other words, but they're talking about the same thing, right? Which is information that's useful to the other person. And for me, I think the most important thing about feedback, or the most powerful strategy, is to encourage the soliciting of feedback frequently and broadly. So just soliciting feedback all the time from different people. That is the most powerful way to get to a feedback culture, because you make it really easy for the other person to give their feedback. The feedback's often more specific, so it's more tied to what you're talking about and what you're asking about, which is what you're interested in. And it also like makes you more ready to listen to the feedback, right? It's saying, okay, like feedback's useful to me. I'm going to ask the question, puts you in a position of kind of power and control and agency. So it's easier to hear it. So that would be my number one suggestion on feedback, is to focus on soliciting feedback. So encouraging everybody to solicit it, and having each of us here in this call, be soliciting feedback all the time, to model the way and to encourage others, to make it safe for them, to make it for them to understand how valuable it is. And for me, the way I think of feedback is just information that's in somebody else's mind. So when I ask for feedback and somebody else shares what they're thinking, they're often doing something that they might not do with other people. Sometimes it feels uncomfortable, right? Sometimes it's something that might be hard for me to hear, or they might not know if it's hard for me to hear. So when they take the risk of sharing information with me, they're giving me a very precious gift, which is for me to know what's in their mind. And so whether I agree with it or not is still something I'm very grateful for, because now I know what they're thinking, right? Now I know what impression I'm doing and what I'm doing, what their perspective is about my behaviors. And so we could talk more about, how I go about giving feedback, or other ways, but that would be the top of mind for me around feedback.
What's the question you ask? I mean, is the question you ask, can you give me some feedback about that? Or do you ask it in a way that doesn't use the capital F word, right? F word feedback, but how do you do it in a way that's takes out the intimidation factor?
It depends on the context. Like often when I'm a public speaker, so I do lots of keynotes, and I like to use live polling during the session for people to reflect and share thinking with each other. So sometimes at the end of the session, I'll have two questions. One of them is like, how well did this session work for you? I think the way that I ask is like, how likely are you to recommend this to somebody else, a session like this? And so they rate it from 1 to 10. So that's an evaluative question. It's not very useful, but it helps me calibrate the second question, which is, and I might ask it in two different questions, like what was most helpful to you? What are you taking away from this? And also like, what could I do differently next time? What should I consider doing differently next time? So those are some ways that are kind of relatively general questions about, hey, how did this land for you? What was useful for you? What could I consider doing differently? But in a different context, I might say, hey, we're going into this meeting together. I'm working on, being clear or being more concise or whatever it is. I want you to watch out for that. And after a meeting, I want you to give me your feedback. I welcome feedback on anything, but in particular, like, can I be more concise? And do you have any suggestions on that? So there are times for me to be very specific to help other people look for something and make it easier for them to give me feedback around something specific. And sometimes being more general, is helpful as well. It helps me uncover blind spots, right, that I may not be thinking about.
I love that. I love that. Well, for those who are joining, if you have a question that you use to solicit feedback that's helpful for you, share that with us as well, please. It'd be really helpful.
And regarding the word, because you asked about, do I use the word feedback? I do. I usually use the word feedback. Sometimes people have an aversion to feedback, but especially if we are working with colleagues and we have set the stage, right? We have shared our views of feedback, our interest in feedback. We have aligned on, hey, we want a learning culture here. Part of what we want is to be giving feedback and receiving feedback to each other. Does that make sense? Are people interested in that? Do people have concerns about that? Then you open the space for a conversation. And then somebody else might say, I don't like that word. Let's use a different word. And then you can like talk about it and align on what word you're going to use and what you mean by that word. So that's different than when you're going to a stranger and you ask them a question. You might not have aligned on the words that you're using. So different contexts call for different ways to communicate, I think.
Mm. Yeah, I love that. I mean, you intimated this, Eduardo, but maybe just to put a pin to narrow it down a little bit, put a finer point on it, is like it's not just the constructive negative stuff too, right? The positive stuff is super helpful, and the specificity, I think, makes
Yeah.
it a really big difference. I always laugh because when I was initially like, when I was like a baby manager, just brand new into the managerial role, still working in a law firm, the advice I got was, sandwich the feedback, something positive, something negative, something, there's lots of words for that now, feedback sandwich being one of them, is I think what are your thoughts on that? And do you feel like that hampers the effectiveness?
I think, my sense is that that it does hamper the effectiveness. It also, I mean, I think to me, it's for the people that I work more closely with. I tend to just want I mean, what was helpful to them and what was not helpful to them, and not try to force, one or the other. But I think that for me, it's like what is in your mind and what it's about uncovering what I might not know that they're thinking, right? And so some of
Mhm.
those things are really helpful things. Some of those things are um, some of those things are really helpful things I did that I didn't know that I did or that I wasn't sure were very powerful. Some of those things are things that I was doing that was causing a different intention from what I meant. Um, and so often the challenge that I often run into is when I ask for feedback, people say, that was great, right? Or they say only positive things and general and vague things. And so then I have to like ask follow-up questions because of like, okay, like what's one thing that I could consider doing differently next time? Like that's where I usually push is, all right, give me one thing that, that I could learn, right? It's great that this worked well for you, but what's one thing that I might be unaware of or that I might consider changing and push them there? Then they eventually struggle, but they come up with something, and then that something is really useful to me.
Yeah. I want to just go back to the Microsoft example because, that kind of change is difficult and can often be overwhelming. How do you recommend that leaders balance the support and the challenge of this kind of growth mindset shift without it becoming overwhelming?
Well, I mean, I think to me, challenge and support go together, right? So we want all of us to challenge ourselves. And in a growth mindset, we are trying new things, we're looking to grow. But to go beyond the known and to be uncomfortable, we need to be supported. We need to have resources. We need to have access to people who can guide us. And so those things to me go together. And I think with the level of challenge should be not too far out of what we already know what to do, in that we might be kind of completely like it might be so far ahead of what there in learning science you might be aware there's a concept of zone of proximal development, right, which is where you have a certain amount like of capabilities of competence, and then what you want to go is into the zone of proximal development, which is a level of challenge that is challenging but it's not too challenging where it becomes ineffective, where it becomes overwhelming, where it becomes something where you actually can't be making progress because it's too different from what you already know. And so if you find yourself there, then you need to either kind of break it down into chunks or somehow decrease the level of challenge to find that level where you are making consistent progress. And to make consistent progress, often it's really helpful to have the support that you need, which might be different depending on the capabilities and the context.
Yeah, I love that. I want to acknowledge a couple comments that are coming in on the chat as well, Eduardo. So Tracy says, for myself and something I tell others is to think of feedback as a resource, not a judgment. Yeah, that's
Yeah,
really helpful. It's really
great.
helpful.
Absolutely. And it's a
And then,
perspective, and you might agree or disagree with it. Like it's not, first of all, when we listen to feedback, it's often to helpful to ask follow-up questions and be thankful, like to express thank you for what the person shared, and not jump into judgment or defensiveness, right? And an evaluation of whether you agree or disagree, right? First, we just want to listen and ask follow-up questions to better understand what the person's saying. And then with time, we can think about it, reflect on it, and think about whether we agree or not, or we would adapt it or get information from other people. But regardless of whether we agree or not, the information is useful.
yeah, for sure. It's data. It's data, right?
Data. Yeah.
Um, and Susan has a nice bridge to the mentoring world here and says, in mentoring, I sense that the feedback sandwich approach can work for those connections that aren't as developed or strong. But in connections where they've really achieved a pattern of growth mindset in their conversations, it feels fake and a more direct feedback approach can be used. Yeah.
I completely agree. Yeah, it so depends how we communicate on the relationship we have, the understanding, how comfortable the person is with feedback and with learning oriented conversation. So I completely agree.
Yeah. In the mentoring world, Eduardo, we talk a lot about the importance of setting agreements, whether formal or informal at the beginning. And it strikes me as we're having this conversation, the importance of having agreements around feedback. Um, right. So, setting the expectation that in order for this relationship to be successful, we have to be giving each other feedback continuously, as opposed to just, one cataclysmic session where it's like a feedback session, right?
I
Ongoing.
agree. Yeah. And I would add that it's not one conversation. It's like something that we need to come back to and like reflect on, and how did we do and did we deviate, so that we remind each other and continue to make sure that we are better understanding what we mean and continuing to align on what those norms are.
Mm, I love that. I love that. And hi, Andrea. Andrea's shared there's two thoughts I have on feedback and mentoring. Speak to feedback and how the words used can develop a fixed or growth mindset. And then ask, might I offer you some feedback?
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah. Um, one question that came in ahead of time from one of the participants is, how do you recommend they work with graduate supervisors and students to encourage a growth mindset when there's conflict in the supervisory relationship? And I imagine that can be applicable in the corporate world as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So conflict is definitely a big topic, and how we handle conflict has, I think, a lot, just like how we influence people, which is part of the question, or how we handle conflict, that depends on so many things, right? It depends on how much trust do we have in the relationship between us and them, or it sounds like here there's three people. So how much trust is there in each other relationship? What are the goals? Do people have common shared goals that are they trying to achieve the same thing, or are they trying to achieve different things? Do people respect each other? Do they look up to each other? What are people's motivations? What is each person trying to achieve? So there's so much that plays into how do we approach if we're trying to influence somebody else, and if we are trying to resolve constructive conflict, or resolve conflict constructively. So in the growth mindset, there's research that shows that when we believe people can change, we approach conflict much more constructively, right? Because we are more curious, we ask more questions, we listen better, we're more open to changing our thinking, and so we are, rather than trying to beat the. So we first of all we attribute the negative behavior to things that can change in the other person, rather than label them in fixed ways. This person is XYZ. And so we respond by engaging in more conversation, right? Sharing our perspectives, asking questions, listening to their perspective. And that leads to much more constructive conflict resolution. But in general, to answer the question, I would say I would start with people's motivations. What are their goals? What are they trying to achieve? And then are they compatible? And if so, like what's getting in the way, right? Like, what is it? Is it fixed mindsets? Is it the conflict? Like what is in getting in the way of what people are trying to achieve? And trying to go from there. But it is a big question. It depends on lots of things. I don't know if anybody else has any more kind of insights on the question.
Hmm. Yeah, if anyone does, please share either in the chat or just raise your hand and unmute yourself. Meantime, I want to shift a little bit more to the mentoring context, Eduardo, and Susan, I'll get to your question in a second as well. It's a great question. But I think I just want to set the stage for it a little bit. So, um, how do you see the growth mindset enhancing the mentoring relationship? And I'm wondering if you have any examples where you've seen that the growth mindset transform the mentoring dynamic.
Sure. Well, I think, in my mind, like a growth mindset is almost like a starting point. Growth mindset is a starting point for learning, and I think it's a starting point for a mentoring relationship. Like I think mentoring is all about supporting development of somebody, right? So I would think that if a mentee is interested in a mentor and a mentoring, like what can be a two-way mentoring relationship, in a mentoring relationship, the purpose of the mentoring relationship, I think, is to help somebody develop, and to develop, we need to change, we need to evolve over time. So I think it's implied, right, that if somebody is entering into a mentoring relationship, um, there's the goal of changing, there's the goal of evolving. Sometimes somebody might think of mentoring in a different way, like more like sponsorship, right, where you might think about more what are you trying to achieve, but without the understanding that in order to grow, you need to change. But I think in general, the more people understand that we're all evolving and changing over time, and that the mentoring relationship is a resource for us to do that, I think the mentoring relationship can be more effective. I don't know what you would add to that, Lisa.
Yeah, no, I think that that's right. And role clarification is so important. What are your expectations of a mentor? What are your expectations of a mentee? Why are you in it? And what are the outcomes that you're looking to achieve from this mentoring relationship? And then being clear that feedback and learning, we say often, it's sort of the mantra that I just rolls off my lips, which is that learning is the purpose, the process, and the product of mentoring. Learning is the purpose, the process, the product of mentoring. And if you're in it to learn, you gotta grow. And if you want to grow, um, first of all, the mentor and the mentee have to believe you can,
Hmm.
um, and that each of them individually can. So that's the first piece. But you have to be open to that in order to do it. So I think that
That
that's
makes sense. Yeah, and I think you nodded to this, but it's like the mentor, the more that we understand that we can change and grow as mentors and become more effective in being a mentor, the more that we can, grow and be more effective over time at that role as well.
yeah. And that's why, the old model of mentor is sage on the stage, the Yoda of like this is how it was in my day. That's why it's so insidious, honestly, because the growth mindset isn't built into the to this to the model of, let me just sit at your feet and learn from what you did and follow that.
Right.
That's not a developmental model.
Right.
And
Yeah,
so, it's important to kind of keep those adult learning principles and the growth principles
I agree.
top.
And I would add that creates an opportunity to model being a learner, right? Which then inspires the mentee to also develop as a motivated and effective learner as well. Yeah.
Okay, I want to move to Susan's excellent question, Eduardo, and I'm curious your thoughts about this. Do you have any recommendations for how to frame a question in the mentoring partnership agreement conversation guide? So by way of context, for mentoring program administrators are often providing a guide to mentors and mentees about how to construct that mentoring partnership agreement. So do you have any recommendations for how to frame the question in a mentoring partnership agreement conversation guide to approach the goal of developing a growth mindset in the connection?
I mean, I would love your thoughts on this list, Lisa, too. But I would say, I would think in the brainstorming here that some of the questions that come to mind are first, like, what are you trying to achieve? What is your goal in entering into this mentoring relationship? How can I support you? Uh, Maybe another question is like, what do you feel you need to work on in that I can support you with, right? So what skills or qualities or abilities do you want to be working on in this relationship? Those are some of the questions that come to my mind. But what would you add or edit, Lisa?
Yeah, I love the way you said it. And I'm not sure there's a right way. A different way might be, this is a learning relationship, and we all give and receive feedback differently. Would love to have a conversation about how when feedback has worked for you and when it hasn't, and what you think you need to see in order to be able to be receptive to feedback.
Great. I love that.
Maybe with the guidance, like, do you need more time? Do you need to see things in advance? Is it helpful to see comments in advance and reflect to it? Should I know whether you need to process externally? Like, we often encourage mentors and mentees to talk about the way that they learn best, because ultimately, when they're going to get feedback, it's got to be presented in that way as well.
Cool. Makes sense.
Yeah. Um, let's see. There's so much here still to talk about, and my curiosity is piqued that the questions are generative. But I want to make sure that we talk about mentoring across differences and how a growth mindset plays into that. As I think Eduardo, we spend a lot of time focusing on the importance of bridging differences in mentoring and inviting conversations about identity into mentoring relationships. So I'm wondering how you see the principles of growth mindset enhancing. Excuse me. I'm wondering how a growth mindset can help both mentors and mentees navigate the differences to create more inclusive and effective mentoring relationships.
Sure. So there's a lot of research on growth mindset and diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so to start with, when there are growth mindset interventions to help everybody develop a growth mindset and the belief that abilities can be developed, everybody's learning increases and their performance increases, but the performance increases the most for people who face negative stereotypes. And there's a couple of reasons for that. When we believe that people can change, our our unconscious biases about groups affect us less. Whether we are kind of in a majority group or in a minoritized group. Um, and so, for example, in a minoritized group, sometimes we suffer from something called stereotype threat, which is if we are the only underrepresented person in a room, we face more performance anxiety because if we make a mistake, we fear letting our group down. And so when we are in a growth mindset, understanding that nobody's perfect and everybody can improve, we experience less performance anxiety. And so we can take more risk. We can share our thinking more. We can ask more questions rather than stay quiet and fearful of doing something that might confirm the negative stereotypes. So that's an example of how being a growth mindset supports diversity, equity, inclusion. But in general, in a growth mindset, and this is super important, we all are curious about what we don't know, like what we're unaware of in terms of other people's experiences and where they're coming from, things that they might experience that I don't experience, or the systems that we're part of that are perpetuating inequities. And so how can we learn more about to see those systems and what we can do in order to change those systems? And so in a growth mindset, we're curious, we understand we don't know everything, and that's particularly important when we are working across differences with people who have different experiences than we tend to have.
Mhm. Yeah, I'm so curious to hear more about your comment, which was that and I want to replay it, Eduardo, but I'm having trouble remembering exactly the way that you said it. That I guess I'll ask you to repeat it. When we have differences, we are, what did you say in terms of kind of the receptiveness to learning at the beginning about when we have differences?
I mean, when when we are in a growth mindset, I'm not sure if this was it, but in a growth mindset, um, we when we believe people can change, our unconscious biases about different groups, like we all have stereotypes about
Yes.
different groups that are unconscious. They affect us less when we believe that people are malleable, because we see people more as individuals, right, rather than as fixed. And so we also see them as less, as groups, as less fixed. And so we see a person less as kind of fixed in the negative stereotypes of that group. And so we see people more as individuals and more able to change, more able to chart their own path when we're in a growth mindset.
Yeah, I love that. And probably that we can even relate to them more and see ourselves more. It takes the marginalization away. It's such a
Yeah,
powerful
yeah,
statement that I've not thought
yeah,
about.
yeah.
Um, how how do you suggest that mentors help their mentees to move into more of a growth mindset and away from a fixed mindset, especially when mentees are facing self-doubt and often imposter syndrome in the mentoring context?
Well, a lot of my work is about like how to learn and how to improve. So growth mindset is a belief, right? And aside from the belief that we can change, we also need to know how to change, because the belief is not helpful. It doesn't lead us to growth unless we do something differently, we change something. And the foundation of what helps us learn is not hard work. Like, it's not that if we work hard, we'll get better. That's not the case. In Because the reality is that there's two different forms of hard work. There's hard work to perform or execute, and there's hard work to learn and to improve. And those two are very different things. Like if you see a great performer, whether it's in sports or like say Cirque du Soleil, right? We see them on stage, they do these incredible acrobatic things and beautifully and artistically. And we might think that the reason they're so good at what they do is that they spend 10,000 hours doing that thing, or we see a gymnast or a tennis player, but that's not the case. If they just play tennis or if they just do gymnastics, they will stagnate. When they are working on improvement, right, behind the curtain, when we're not looking at them, they are making lots of mistakes. They're dropping the ball. They're missing the timing because they're working on what they don't know or the next level of challenge. And that's a very different thing than what we do when we're performing. So when we're performing, I call it the performance zone. When we are learning, I call that the learning zone. And we need to habituate the two. Both of them are important, and we can integrate them in what I call learning while doing. But what most people are doing most of the time is just focused on getting things done. They have a task list, they're trying to get through that task list, and they're stuck in chronic performance, and that leads to stagnation. And so one thing that mentors can do is help their mentees think about what are your learning zone habits. The mentoring conversations is an example of that, but we want to give the mentee more agency and more deliberate habits around how to continue to improve and how to continue to improve on their own. So for example, one thing I love to do is to just remind myself every morning of what is one thing that I'm looking to improve and how, right? So if we do, that's a very simple habit that anybody can do, a mentee can do. And then once they develop that habit, they're going to be in the habit of always being working on something that they're looking to improve, right? And so that's super, super important. It can be solicited feedback as a habit that they are working on. It could be experimenting, right? It could be whatever it is that they're doing to improve. What systems and habits are they using and how are they developing those? That is, I think, something that's really powerful.
I love that. I mean, just even that question about what are you looking to improve, or what are you gonna be bold about today, or where whatever the area is having that intentionality. What are some other learning zone habits?
Yeah, so I mean, a lot. We talked about for example, could be reflecting like on mistakes, like because we don't learn from mistakes, we learn from reflecting on mistakes or discussing mistakes. So when
Mhm.
something happens that is not according to plan, we need to not just move forward and say mistakes are fine, let's keep going. We need to think about it and think about, okay, what led to this mistake, and what am I going to change going forward in my processes or in my systems in order to avoid this mistake, right? So that's an example of a learning zone habit. Another example might be kind of after action reviews or mid action reviews. So when we're working on projects, we can like think about how is the way we're working well. Are there things that are not working so well, and things that we could try doing differently, like in how we handle meetings or in how we communicate over email or over Zoom or whatever. How are we working together, and how could we be working differently? That can be happen, when projects are completed, or so that's called an after action review, or in the middle of projects, it's called a mid-action review. We talked about feedback as a really effective learning zone strategy. Meeting agendas is an example of a system that's often only performance oriented, right? It's like, what do we need to get done when, versus embedding learning zone topics in that agenda that changes the conversation. So that can be like, what is there something that somebody learned last week that other people could benefit from? What did you learn, and what can we do differently as a result of that learning? So then we are reflecting more on what we're learning and sharing it with each other, so that what one person's learning, other people can benefit as well. So those are, some of the examples. But I mean, somebody can be taking a course, right? An online course that's a learning zone strategy, or reading a book, or listening to podcasts. Those are all learning zone strategies.
I love that. I love that. I'm so struck by the overlap between the growth mindset work and the trust building and psychological safety building work. I mean, a lot of the behaviors that are learning zone behaviors are also really important when you're building trust in relationships as well. And that's no accident.
Absolutely, yeah. In the learning zone, we're working on what we don't know. That means we're going to be making mistakes, right? So in order to engage in the learning zone, the consequence of those mistakes must not be very material. And often people feel like if they make mistakes, there's going to be negative consequences, right? Whether they're going to get a negative evaluation, or the other person's going to think less of them, right? And so we need safety. We need psychological safety. We need to know that we're going to be okay if things don't go as we hope, in order to take those risks, in order to leap into the learning zone.
Mhm, mhm. Yeah, I love that. There's I don't know if the name Sarah Blakely means anything to you, but she's the founder of Spanx. And there was an interview with her many years ago. She was one of the youngest female self-made billionaires or something at one point. And she said that the thing that was most influential for her in her success is that every night at the dinner table, her father asked her, "How did you fail today?" And I love that question for so many reasons, but it strikes me that, I mean, there's no better growth mindset question than kind of
Yeah,
embracing that as a sign of strength instead of a sign of weakness, right?
totally. Yeah.
Wow. I have about 26 more questions that I would love to discuss with you at some point. And I also want to be respectful of time. This is really, really generative. What is striking you as a takeaway that you hope that all of the people watching this take for them?
Well, I love your quote that learning is and I'm going to butcher it, but learning is the process, outcome, and something of mentoring. What was the third thing?
Purpose, product, and
Purpose.
process of mentoring. Yeah.
Purpose,
Yeah.
process, and outcome. Yeah. So absolutely. I think, mentoring and learning, that just connects, that is just so central. And I loved, your comments and everybody else's comments on kind of the norm setting and how we go about that, and some of the questions that we do around that when in a mentoring relationship. That's something I learned, and I'll continue to think about, because that made me think, and I think it's really important.
Wonderful, wonderful. I am struck by so many great things. Would love to hear the takeaways of each of the folks in attendance. Just put in the chat. It's a great way to just express to Eduardo our thanks for your time today, Eduardo. If folks want to get in touch with you, here are the ways to do that. Highly recommend watching your TED Talk as well as reading your book, The Performance Paradox, as well. Hope you will all join us on November 12th for our next thought leader conversation with Andy Lopata. We will talk about professional relationships in mentoring. His expertise is on networking and creating developmental relationships. So really encourage you all to join us there. Eduardo, many, many thanks for your time, for your insight, for your great and impactful work, and looking forward to speaking with you again soon.
Ditto. Thank you, Lisa, for having me. Thank you for what you do, and everybody for all you do. So have a great rest of your day.
Take care.